Last week, we learned the skill of dividing fractions by knowing that we had to multiply instead by the reciprocal of the divisor instead of just going through with our division. For example, first we have the fraction 3/4 as our divisor. To make it into the reciprocal, we just flip the numerator and denominator and we get 4/3 instead. And if you notice, at first this sign is division, but we have to change that to multiplication because when you switch the number to the reciprocal, you also have to do the inverse operation. So we need to make sure we multiply instead of divide. Once we have our new problem set up, we can go ahead and do our normal fraction multiplication by doing 5 times 4 where we get 20, and by doing 8 times 3 where we get 24. Now we need to do one more step, which is to simplify this fraction. We can do that by dividing by its greatest common factor, which is 4. And once we divide both the numerator and denominator by 4, we will get 5/6. So 5/8 divided by 3/4 equals 5/6. Now that we had that little review, we're going to start our new skill this week, which was dividing mixed numbers. Dividing mixed numbers is a lot like dividing fractions, but we're going to go ahead and introduce the concept by relating it to a real-life situation. The deepest point in Earth's oceans is the Mariana Trench, which is located 6 4/5 miles beneath the ocean's surface. The average depth of the Earth's oceans is 2.5 miles. We can use this information to answer the guiding question, which asks us to write a division expression to find how many times as deep is the Mariana Trench than the average ocean on Earth. We can set up the following problem to help us come up with the answer. We can begin by solving the problem by using 6 4/5 as our dividend, because that is the deepest part of the Earth, which is the Mariana Trench. We're going to divide that by the average depth of the Earth's ocean, which is 2.5 miles, to figure out how many times as deep the Mariana Trench is, which is 6 4/5, than the average oceans on Earth, which is 2.5 miles. Dividing mixed numbers is a lot like dividing fractions. The problem is that we have these whole numbers that we have to deal with as part of our fractions. Remember from multiplying mixed numbers that we cannot separate the whole number from the fraction because they are treated as one value. So what we must do is the same thing that we did when we had to multiply mixed numbers, which is to change each of the mixed numbers in our problem first into improper fractions. Remember, we change mixed numbers into improper fractions by doing the circle of math. Now we come around from our denominator to our mixed number and multiply, and we get a product of 30. Then with 30, we take it around to the numerator and we add on to it, which will give us the improper fraction of 34. And 5 is the denominator because the size of the pieces will still be in fifths. Our division sign will stay the same because we are not doing anything with the actual operations yet. We're just getting our numbers ready to do our operations, which is divide. So we're going to work with 2.5 and make that into an improper fraction by first multiplying the 2 times the 2 to give us a product of 4, and take the 4 around to the numerator by adding, and we do 4 plus 1, which gives us 5, and we're going to have a denominator of 2, so that gives us 5/2 is the equivalent to 2.5. It's just in an improper fraction now. In the last slide, we changed our mixed numbers into improper fractions by making them into 34/5 divided by 5/2. Now we have a regular fraction that we can do the division steps we learned how to do in last week's video. Remember, the first fraction stays the same, so the 34/5 will remain as 34/5. However, we need to make sure we find the reciprocal of 5/2 by flipping the numerator and the denominator, so 5/2 will now become 2/5. And since we changed and we made the 5/2 into its reciprocal, which is 2/5, we must also use the inverse operation of division, which is multiplication. Now we definitely have a problem that we know how to do, and we can go ahead and start multiplying. 34 times 2 will give us 68, and 5 times 5 will give us 25. Now we're not done yet because 68 over 25 is an improper fraction. That means we have a number that is represented as a fraction, but it's greater than 1 because the numerator is larger than the denominator. A lot of you recently on assignments and quizzes have been wanting to divide no matter what, but just make sure if this numerator is not larger than the denominator, you can leave it alone and just simplify. However, in this case, since we have a 68 as the numerator and a 25 as the denominator, we have to divide to make it into a mixed number. Therefore, we have to do the problem 68 divided by 25 and work out the long division. So 25 goes into 68 2 times because 25 times 2 is 50 and 60 minus 58 is 18. So that is our remainder, and our denominator is still 25, and that is already in simplest form. So our answer is 2 and 18/25, which goes back to our question that we had before. The Mariana Trench is 2 and 18/25 times as deep as the average ocean. Let's go ahead and try another problem with dividing mixed numbers. We're going to start out with the problem 5½ divided by 2½. Now the first step is to change each of our mixed numbers into improper fractions. So we're going to go back and use that circle of math that we learned, and we're going to multiply the 5 times 2 to get 10, and then we come around to the numerator and add our product to the 1, and we have 11 halves. Remember, the denominator stays the same. The division sign also stays the same now because we are still working with the numbers, getting them ready to divide. We do the same thing with 2½, multiply around, we get 4 as our product, and to the numerator we add, and we have 5/2 for that. Now it looks like we have fractions that are ready to go for our division problem, so we have to go to those rules now. Remember, the 11/2 will stay the same because our dividend doesn't change. However, we need to make sure in our divisor, since we're dividing, we change the divisor to the reciprocal, which is 2/5, and since we did that, we have to do the inverse operation, which is to multiply, and we can multiply now and do 11 times 2 and get 22, and 2 times 5, which is 10. Now you'll notice that we have an improper fraction since our numerator is larger than our denominator, and we'll need to do the division problem 22 divided by 10, and I'm going to do it over off to the side. 22 divided by 10. 10 can go into 22 2 times. 10 times 2 is 20. 22 minus 20 is 2, so that's our remainder. So we have 2 and 2/10. And that will need to be simplified because 2 and 10 are both even numbers. So we know we can divide both of those by 2. And that will give us a final answer of 2 and 1/5. We're going to try one more problem together. We're going to do 8 divided by 2½. And an example that we used in class was we used property. So if somebody might have 8 acres of property and they wanted to divide it into parts that were 2½ acres each, we would want to know how many parts they could have in their property. And we talked about dividing these up into equal-sized gardens, using equal parts for a pool and room to play in. And so these are just real-life applications that we can use. Now this one is a little unique because we have 8 as a whole number. And you should remember from multiplying and our beginning dividing fractions, anytime you see this type of number, you can just make it into a fraction by putting it over 1. because 8 divided by 1 is still 8. So putting 1 as the denominator will not change the value of this fraction. Next, we need to do 2.5 into an improper fraction. So that would be 2 times 2, which would give us 4. And then once we did the 2 times 2 to get 4, we would do 4 plus the 1, which would then give us 5. So that would give us 5 halves, because our denominator stays the same, and we're still using our division sign. We haven't done any reciprocals yet. So our 8 over 1 will stay the same, and since 5 halves is our divisor, that's the one we need to find the reciprocal for. The reciprocal of 5 halves is 2/5, and since we found the reciprocal, we need to make sure we do the inverse operation, which is multiplication. And we can go ahead and multiply now. 8 times 2 is 16, and 1 times 5 is 5. And again, we have an improper fraction, so we have to divide. Off to the side, we're going to do 16 divided by 5. 5 can go into 16 3 times. 5 times 3 is 15. 16 minus 15 is 1, so our remainder is 1, and our denominator is 5. So 16/5 as an improper fraction is equivalent to the mixed number 3 and 1/5.